Good morning. Our sermon for this morning is on our gospel reading and Jesus turning over the tables of the money changers. The scene of Jesus turning over the tables of various businesses located on the Jerusalem temple grounds is found in all four gospels, which leads scholars to believe that this event truly did occur in Jesus' life. The version from John we read today locates the event at an early point in his ministry, just after the first public miracle he performs at the wedding at Cana. The other three Gospels have Jesus clearing the temple during his final week of life in Jerusalem. It is more likely that the other Gospels have it more historically accurate. But John uses Jesus' clearing of the temple to make a theological point more than to describe history. The money changers and many other businesses located in a large open-air courtyard were a part of the temple system. And this is where, in this large open-air courtyard, is where non-Jews could also be, as opposed to the Jewish exclusive inner courtyards of the temple, and the temple itself where only the priestly elite were allowed. This Gentile courtyard was an area bustling with activity and was most often used as a public gathering space for discussion. This is where Jesus was found as a young boy listening to the religious teachers and asking them questions. When Jesus was in Jerusalem, he most often taught here in this public courtyard. When Peter gave his second public sermon after Pentecost, it was here. And it said that 5,000 people that were there became Christians that day, giving the largest initial push that started Christianity. The money changers were in a sanctioned gathering space for Gentiles where the discussion and exchange of ideas and goods was encouraged. In the other Gospels, Jesus' problem with the money changers is their unjust lending practices, and he calls the place a den of robbers. But the practices happening in the courtyard were in many ways legitimate and necessary. Both foreign people and foreign money weren't allowed in God's temple. Animal sacrifices were needed to be purchased because most people didn't bring an unblemished goat or doves with them when they came from the countryside. In John's version, Jesus doesn't call the place a den of robbers, but he calls it what it is, a marketplace. For the temple to work, the transactions of a marketplace were essential. Clearing the businesses out of the temple would be like Pastor Richards, our emeritus pastor, who causes a lot of trouble around here, becoming enraged and slapping the offering plates out of the usher's hands and declaring, "We should never take offerings again. Money taints this house of worship." And all of you cheer. We love you, Pastor Richards. But David and I would be sad because we've grown accustomed to things like food, which thankfully your offerings pay for. Without the marketplace, there would be no sacrifices at the temple, which would mean the end of the whole temple system. In John's gospel, Jesus is not reclaiming the temple. That is what he does in the other gospels, but in John, he's not reclaiming the temple. Jesus is saying that it has come time for the whole temple system, with its sacrifices and its altars and its priests, to end. The Gospel of John was written last of all the Gospels and the longest after Jesus' death, and the historically and religiously significant event of the destruction of the temple forever by the Romans. The Christian audiences for whom the other Gospels were written were basically Jewish Christians because Christianity hadn't broken away from Judaism. And they were still intermingled together because the most prominent Christian leaders were Christians who still saw themselves as faithful Jews. But in John, alternatively, John was written 70 years after Jesus died and came back, and 25 years after the destruction of the temple, during a time when the first Jewish Christian leaders of Christianity had died off, and the Jewish community had grieved the loss of the temple and formally shifted to what we know as Rabbinic Judaism. In John's gospel, Jesus is not reclaiming the temple. Jesus is reinterpreting the temple and how people connect with God, away from a system that just won't be around for very long. We are going to stop taking your money because we aren't going to do religion like this anymore. Just to be clear, we at Lutheran Church of the Master will be taking your money. And we're very thankful. Historically speaking, Jesus most likely was angry about unjust business practices and Roman businessmen making off with God's faithful people's money. But in John repurposes that story to make a different theological point about shifts in belief systems. We aren't going to do religion like this anymore. In John's gospel, the deconstruction of religion through the overturning of the marketplace leads to a very significant question about Jesus. The point of the table-turning story in John's gospel and why it comes so early in the narrative is to get the people into the narrative to ask this: what gives you the right? On what authority are you doing this? The people essentially ask for some sort of proof that Jesus has the right to do what he did, turning up and down the table and clearing it of businesses. They ask for a sign of authority along the lines of the miracle that he just did at Cana. The answer, the miracle, the sign that shows his authority to end one form of religion and institute a new way of connecting with God is the resurrection. Resurrection is something that readers of the gospel, you and I, people 70 years after Jesus had come, are well aware of. But rising up after 3 days sounds like unintelligible crazy talk to the characters who saw him do this at the temple and watched Jesus make a mess of the temple. What sign can you show us for doing this? Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The basic conversation with Jesus in this story goes like this: you don't need church anymore because you got me. Oh yeah, who are you? I am the resurrection. Jesus is the resurrection. There are many things that will try to take up residence in your heart and convince you that they are life-giving to you. They ask for your allegiance and want to be your God. Money can be foremost among those things vying for us. Jesus is saying, I am the source of life that will last and will sustain you when all other things fall away. During the season of Lent, we read stories like Jesus turning over the tables of the money changers, and the church asks us to contemplate how our lives should change to be more in line with the kind of life Jesus would want of us. Is the turning over the tables an instructive example for how to be a disciple of Jesus? In the other Gospels, Jesus is willing to publicly take a stand against injustice, oppose the taking advantage of the poor, speak up to a corrupt religious system that serves economic and political interests of an elite class. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is confronting the people with a hard truth that the belief system that they've carried around with them will not take them any farther. Change is coming, Jesus says. Change is coming, but it is from God, and it will be a blessing to you. Spiritual questions for us from this gospel story for Lent are: when is God calling you to speak truth in love? When is God calling for a change, a shift, a reinterpretation of your perspectives? When is compromise not an option? When is risk warranted? The disciples come to understand in retrospect that our salvation is what Jesus is willing to risk for. Our salvation is what Jesus is unwilling to compromise about. In John, the money changer scene establishes the authority that Jesus gets to say who and how people are saved. Jesus decides. Jesus leads. And Jesus leads to salvation. Will you follow Jesus into risk, into the refusal of compromise and a new way of life when God's love asks you to change? What will you do when Jesus turns over your tables? May you be blessed hearing this sermon as I have been blessed preaching it. Amen.